The old photograph sat there, just like hundreds of others from its time. It was an 1889 portrait, a window into a world long gone. In the center, two young sisters posed formally, dressed in their best period attire. Their dresses were stiff, probably made of heavy wool or dark cotton, with lace collars that looked a bit too tight. Their hair was neatly parted and pulled back, typical of the era. At first glance, it was an innocent picture, the kind you might find in an old family album or a dusty antique shop. It screamed Victorian-era formality, a snapshot of family life from a time when photography was still a serious, almost sacred event. You could imagine the photographer, probably a stern-faced man with a black cloth over his head, telling the girls to hold still, to look at the lens, not to blink. The girls themselves, one perhaps 10 and the other a few years younger, had expressions that were hard to read. There was a faint hint of unease in their eyes, maybe even a forced smile on the older sister's lips. But you'd easily dismiss it. This was 1889 after all. People didn't smile broadly in photographs back then. It was just the stiffness of the era, the long exposure times, the general seriousness of having your likeness captured for posterity. It wasn't a selfie, it was an event. The background of the photo suggested a comfortable home, maybe an upper-middle-class setting. There was a heavy curtain, a bit of ornate wallpaper, and what looked like a dark, polished wooden chair. Everything pointed to a typical domestic scene, a family proud enough to afford a professional photographer to immortalize their children. Photography was a big deal then, a way to capture moments that would otherwise fade, a record for future generations. This picture seemed to have fulfilled that role, passing quietly through the years. It could have been found at a flea market, in a forgotten box in an attic, or maybe donated to a historical society, its story untold, its faces anonymous. For decades, the portrait was just that, an old photo. It might have been admired for its historical value, its clear depiction of Victorian fashion, or simply as a curiosity from the past. It wasn't until much later, when it resurfaced at a small online auction, that someone looked at it with different eyes. It wasn't an immediate moment of horror, no sudden gasp from a startled viewer. It was far more subtle than that. The person who stumbled upon it was a digital archivist, someone whose job involved scanning and cataloging old photographs for a historical society. They had seen thousands of similar images. This one was just another entry in a long queue. They scanned it, ran it through some basic enhancement software to clean up dust and scratches, and prepared it for upload. But as the image processed, a small, almost imperceptible detail caught their eye. It was a faint, shadowy area in the deep background, behind the younger sister's left shoulder. It looked like nothing, a smudge, a trick of the light, easily ignored, but something about it made them pause. The archivist, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Reed, had a knack for details. She'd spent her career looking at things others missed. Her initial thought was that it was a flaw in the old photographic plate, or perhaps some damage to the paper, but the way the shadow seemed to have a faint, almost organic shape to it, rather than the random splotch of a smudge, nagged at her. She zoomed in just a little, using the basic tools in her software. Still nothing definitive. It was just a darker patch in an already dark corner of the room. She was about to dismiss it, to mark it as a minor artifact, when something made her hold back. A tiny, almost imperceptible line, like the edge of something solid, seemed to emerge from the darkness. It was enough to make her take a closer look, to pull the portrait from the immediate upload queue. The image, once just another piece of history, was now something else. It held a secret, hidden in plain sight for over a century. The innocent gaze of the two sisters, the formal setting, the typical Victorian scene, it was all a front, and the subtle anomaly, lurking in the shadows, was about to change everything anyone thought they knew about this seemingly harmless photograph. The journey of the portrait, from a simple family record to a chilling historical document, had just begun. Dr. Reed decided to dedicate more time to the photograph. This wasn't a quick scan and upload job anymore. She pulled up the high-resolution scan on a larger monitor, one designed for detailed image analysis. Her initial dismissal of the shadow as a simple flaw faded completely as she began to apply more sophisticated digital tools. She started with a basic contrast and brightness adjustment, trying to tease out any hidden information. The shadow behind the younger girl's shoulder still held its secrets, a stubborn patch of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She tried different filters, some designed to reduce noise, others to enhance edges. It was slow work, meticulous, and often frustrating. For a while, it seemed like her initial instinct was right, that it was just a random defect. But then, as she adjusted the gamma correction, a faint outline began to solidify within the gloom. It wasn't a clear image, not yet, but it was definitely something. A vertical line, then a horizontal one, suggesting a shape that was too deliberate to be a smudge. It was like looking at a faint image through frosted glass, knowing there was something there but unable to make it out clearly. The more she worked, the more intrigued she became. Her academic curiosity, which usually focused on the social history embedded in photographs, now shifted to the photographic process itself and what this particular image might be hiding. She experimented with color channel separation, a technique sometimes used in forensic photography to reveal details obscured by a dominant color. In one of the channels, the red channel perhaps, the vague shape became a little more defined. A curve here, an angle there. It wasn't human yet, but it was definitely a presence. The feeling in the room changed for Dr. Reed. What started as a technical puzzle began to feel more like an archaeological dig, uncovering layers of information. She found herself leaning closer to the screen, her eyes straining, trying to force the image to reveal itself. She even tried inverting the colors, sometimes a surprising way to see things differently. That didn't help much, but it confirmed the consistency of the anomaly. It wasn't just a random pixel cluster. It was a consistent, albeit faint, pattern. She decided to try a more advanced technique, multispectral imaging. This involved analyzing the image data across different light wavelengths, beyond what the human eye could see. It was a long shot, usually reserved for damaged or faded documents, but she felt a growing conviction that this was no ordinary photograph. She submitted the digital file to a specialized imaging lab, explaining her suspicions. It took a few days for the results to come back, and during that time, Dr. Reed found herself constantly thinking about the portrait, the innocent faces of the girls now seeming almost like a distraction, a deliberate misdirection from the real mystery. When the enhanced images finally arrived, Dr. Reed felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with technical challenge and everything to do with what she was seeing. The anomaly was no longer ambiguous. The specialized imaging had cut through the layers of shadow and time, revealing a clearer, if still unsettling form. It was indeed a figure, partially obscured by the darkness of the room, positioned just behind the younger sister. Its position was odd, almost as if it were trying to hide, or perhaps trying to blend into the furniture. The figure was tall and slender, its outline distinct against the dark wall. It wasn't a person standing casually. Its posture was stiff, almost rigid, and its head was slightly tilted. The most disturbing detail was the face, or rather, the lack of one. The imaging had revealed the contours of a head, but the features were indistinct, blurred, or perhaps simply not there. It was like a blank canvas, a void where eyes and a mouth should be. Yet the overall impression was undeniably human, or at least humanoid. It wore what looked like dark, formal clothing, blending almost perfectly with the deep shadows of the room. Its hands, if they were hands, were also indistinct, fading into the darkness, but they seemed to be clasped together, or perhaps holding something small and dark. Dr. Reed felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't a trick of light, or a smudge, or a forgotten prop. This was something else entirely. The figure was clearly part of the original photograph. It wasn't added later. It wasn't a defect. It was there in the room when the photographer took the picture. The expert, who usually approached historical artifacts with detached academic interest, now felt a genuine sense of dread. This wasn't just a discovery. It was an intrusion into a seemingly normal past, revealing something deeply unsettling. The initial ambiguity was gone, replaced by a certainty that only deepened the mystery. Why was it there? Why was it so carefully hidden in the shadows? And most importantly, were the two young girls in the portrait aware of its presence? Dr. Reed looked at their faces again, their forced Victorian smiles, their rigid postures. Did that stiffness come from the long exposure time required for old cameras, or from something else? A forced normalcy in the presence of something they couldn't or weren't allowed to acknowledge? The questions piled up, each one more unsettling than the last. The photograph, once a simple historical curiosity, had transformed into a chilling enigma, a silent witness to a hidden presence. And Dr. Reed knew, with a growing sense of unease, that she had only just begun to uncover its secrets. The need for more clarity pushed Dr. Reed to pursue even more sophisticated digital forensics. She collaborated with a team specializing in historical image restoration, known for their ability to pull detail from the most degraded photographs without altering the original data. This process was slow, painstaking, and required immense precision. They weren't just enhancing, they were meticulously reconstructing, pixel by pixel, what the original plate had captured. Each layer of shadow was peeled back, not removed, but analyzed for information it might contain. It was like sifting through dust for microscopic clues, but instead of physical particles, they were dealing with light and darkness. The team worked for weeks, running algorithms that compensated for light diffraction, lens aberrations, and the chemical inconsistencies of 19th-century photographic emulsions. They used techniques that could differentiate between true shadow and obscured form, gradually bringing out contours and textures that were previously indistinguishable. The goal was not to invent details, but to reveal what was truly present in the original capture, however faint. And with every passing day, the figure in the background became less ambiguous, less a suggestion, and more a concrete, undeniable presence. The confirmation came not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, creeping certainty, like a shadow slowly solidifying in the corner of a room. It was, beyond any doubt, a distinct humanoid figure. As the image became clearer, the chilling details of the figure emerged. Its posture was not just stiff, but almost contorted, leaning awkwardly against the wall, as if trying to shrink itself to become one with the dark wood paneling. Its partial visibility was unsettling. Only its torso, head, and one arm were clearly discernible, the rest fading into the deep, inky blackness behind it, as if it were dissolving or incomplete. The most disturbing aspect was its head. The blankness Dr. Reed had first noticed was still there, a smooth, featureless oval where a face should be. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a void. Yet the shape of the head, the curve of the neck, and the subtle slope of the shoulders made it undeniably human in form, creating a profound sense of unease. It was a human shape, but without any human identity. The figure wore what appeared to be dark, heavy fabric, possibly a coat or a cloak, which helped it blend seamlessly with the shadows. Its single visible arm was bent at an odd angle. The hand, if it was a hand, was obscured, but it seemed to press against the wall, as if holding itself upright. It wasn't merely standing, it was looming, a silent, dark sentinel in the background, almost a part of the room's architecture. The way it seemed to blend with the shadows, almost a part of the room's darkness, was not accidental. It was as if it had been placed there with the express purpose of being overlooked, a deliberate camouflage. The implication was clear. This figure was not meant for casual observation. It was either deliberately hidden by someone, or it was a presence that simply existed in the shadows, unseen by most, yet captured by the lens. This revelation naturally led Dr. Reed to re-examine the girl's expressions with a new, unsettling perspective. Before, their stiff, unsmiling faces were easily attributed to the long exposure times and rigid formality of Victorian portraiture. Now, however, those same expressions seemed to take on a different meaning. The younger sister, closest to the hidden figure, had a slight downturn to her mouth, an almost imperceptible hint of a frown that could easily be missed. Her eyes, though looking directly at the camera, held a vacant quality, a hollowness that now seemed less like photographic stiffness and more like a deeper internal struggle. Was it fear, resignation, or a forced normalcy, a practiced composure in the presence of something terrifying that they were forbidden to acknowledge? The older sister, while also stiff, had a gaze that seemed to extend beyond the photographer, beyond the room, almost as if she were looking into the distance, perhaps trying to escape the present moment. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white, a small detail that Dr. Reed had previously dismissed as proper Victorian etiquette, but now saw as a potential sign of tension, of suppressed emotion. The chilling thought began to take root. Were they aware of it? Did they know this figure was there, lurking just out of sight, just behind them? Did its presence explain the subtle unease in their posture, the distant quality in their eyes, the forced nature of their composure? The portrait, once a quaint glimpse into a bygone era, had transformed into something far more sinister. It was no longer just a picture of two sisters. It was a captured moment of a chilling encounter, a silent testament to a hidden horror. The innocence of the scene had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by a profound sense of dread and a multitude of unanswered questions. The figure, once a faint anomaly, was now a stark, undeniable reality, casting a long, dark shadow over the lives of the two young girls it shared the frame with. The investigation had just begun, and Dr. Reed knew that uncovering the truth behind this silent observer would be a journey into a past far darker than any she had anticipated. The blank face of the figure seemed to hold all the answers, yet revealed nothing, forcing her to dig deeper, to find the story behind the silence. With the hidden figure now undeniably present in the portrait, Dr. Reed's focus shifted from photographic analysis to historical detective work. The next logical step was to identify the sisters and their family. This meant diving deep into genealogical records, scouring local archives, and poring over historical documents from the late 19th century. She enlisted the help of a research assistant, a history graduate student named Mark, whose knack for digging up obscure details was legendary among the faculty. They started with the obvious, attempting to find any records related to the photographer, hoping it would lead them to client lists or specific families. This proved difficult, as many local photographers from that era kept poor records, or their archives had simply been lost to time. They then turned to a more painstaking method, cross-referencing photographic styles and clothing with known family portraits from the region where the photo was believed to have originated. This was a slow, often frustrating process, sifting through countless sepia-toned faces, but eventually a breakthrough came. A small, almost illegible inscription on the back of the original photographic plate, discovered during a second, even more meticulous examination, provided a crucial clue. Ilara and Beatrice, 1889, and below that a faint address, too faded to read completely, but clearly pointing to a specific town in rural New England. Armed with this, Mark delved into the town's historical society records, local newspapers, and even old cemetery plots. It took weeks, but he finally pieced together enough information to identify the family, the Caldwells, Ilara and Beatrice Caldwell, daughters of a moderately successful merchant, Thomas Caldwell, and his wife, Clara. The family lived in a substantial house on the outskirts of town, built in the 1870s. The initial findings painted a picture of a respectable, if somewhat private family. However, the further Mark dug, the more cracks appeared in this seemingly ordinary facade. The town itself had a history, like many old New England settlements, steeped in local folklore and whispered ghost stories. Dr. Reed and Mark started noticing a pattern. Several accounts from the late 1800s mentioned strange occurrences in the vicinity of the Caldwell home. Old newspaper clippings, often dismissed as sensationalism at the time, spoke of unexplained disappearances or unsettling shadows seen near the property. There were tales of servants leaving abruptly, refusing to return, muttering about cold spots and watching eyes. One particularly chilling anecdote found in a collection of local legends compiled in the 1930s described a silent man who was said to wander the Caldwell grounds at night, a figure that never spoke, never made a sound, and whose face was always obscured by shadow or turned away. This silent man legend immediately caught Dr. Reed's attention. The description, though vague, resonated with the hidden figure in the portrait. Its shadowy form, its obscured features, its unsettling stillness. Could this be more than just a local superstition? Could it be a collective memory, passed down through generations, of a real presence that haunted the Caldwell family? As they connected these dots, the innocent portrait began to transform further in their minds. It wasn't just a photograph with a hidden detail. It was a potential historical document of a shared terror. Mark found records of a significant tragedy that struck the Caldwell family shortly after the portrait was taken. Thomas Caldwell, the father, died unexpectedly just 6 months later, officially attributed to a sudden illness. But the local gossip columns, though subtle, hinted at something more. Neighbors spoke of his declining health, not just physically, but mentally, becoming increasingly withdrawn and fearful in the months leading up to his death. Clara, the mother, also became a recluse, rarely seen outside the house after her husband's passing. Then there was the unsettling detail about a previous resident of the Caldwell house. Before the Caldwells moved in, the property had been owned by a reclusive elderly woman who was said to have practiced unusual arts. After her death, the house stood empty for several years because of local rumors and a perceived unpleasant atmosphere. The Caldwells had purchased it at a reduced price, dismissing the whispers as mere superstition. The initial hypotheses began to form, swirling around Dr. Reed's mind. Could the hidden figure be a manifestation of this previous resident's unusual arts? Was it a lingering spirit, a malevolent entity tied to the property that the Caldwells unknowingly brought into their lives? Or perhaps, and this was a more disturbing thought, was it a deceased family member, someone never officially accounted for, whose presence continued to haunt the living? The silent man legend, combined with the Caldwell family's subsequent misfortunes, suggested a deeper, darker truth. The portrait, once a simple family photo, was slowly revealing itself to be a chilling document, a frozen moment in time that captured not just two sisters, but a profound, unspoken fear that permeated their home. The blank face of the figure, once a mystery, now seemed to hold the key to a forgotten tragedy, a silent scream from the past. Dr. Reed felt a growing sense of responsibility, knowing that uncovering this truth was vital, not just for academic curiosity, but to give voice to the silent terror of Ilara and Beatrice. The deeper they dug into the Caldwell family's history, the more unsettling details surfaced. Dr. Reed and Mark spent weeks sifting through old town records, newspaper archives, and even dusty church ledgers. They found no immediate record of any other children beyond Ilara and Beatrice, which ruled out the forgotten child theory for the hidden figure, at least for now. However, the period around 1889, the year the portrait was taken, seemed to be a turning point for the family, a shift from quiet prosperity to something much darker. Thomas Caldwell's death, initially dismissed as a sudden illness, started to look less straightforward. While no foul play was officially recorded, the local doctor's notes from that time were unusually brief and vague. There were mentions of extreme mental distress, and unexplained fevers in the weeks leading up to his passing. Before his death, Thomas had also made several frantic visits to a lawyer, attempting to sell the house quickly, even at a significant loss. These attempts were unsuccessful, and the historical records showed the house remained in the family's name. This detail was significant. It suggested a desperate urgency to escape the property, a fear that transcended financial concerns. Mark then found a series of letters written by Clara Caldwell, Thomas's wife, to her sister who lived in a neighboring town. These letters, discovered in a forgotten box at the local historical society, painted a picture of increasing isolation and fear. In the early letters, Clara wrote about the children's schooling, garden plans, and social calls. But after 1888, the tone shifted dramatically. She spoke less of daily life and more of unseen presences, cold spots in the house, and the constant feeling of being watched. She mentioned Thomas's growing pallor and his nightmares, which he described as being pursued by a silent, looming shadow. She even hinted at Elara and Beatrice speaking to someone who wasn't there, but she quickly dismissed it as childish imagination, though her words carried an underlying tremor of doubt. This information tied directly back to the Silent Man legend. The figure in the portrait, silent and looming, seemed to be manifesting not just in local folklore, but within the Caldwell household itself. The reclusive elderly woman who previously owned the house also became a focal point. Her name was Mrs. Abernathy, and she was known to dabble in spiritualism and what the townspeople called folk magic. After her death, her belongings were mostly burned due to their unholy nature, but a few items, including some strange carved wooden effigies, were reportedly buried on the property. This suggested a possible connection to the figure. Could the Silent Man be a lingering remnant of Mrs. Abernathy's practices, a spirit or entity she had perhaps summoned or bound to the land? New theories about the hidden figure's identity began to solidify. It wasn't just a random ghost, it was tied to the house, to its history, and perhaps to the ritualistic practices of its former owner. The figure's blank face, once a source of mystery, now seemed like a deliberate choice, perhaps reflecting an entity that had no true face, no human identity, but merely a presence. It was a watcher, a silent observer whose influence slowly eroded the sanity and well-being of those it haunted. The increasing sense of dread among the researchers was palpable. Each new piece of information acted like a brushstroke, slowly revealing a horrific tableau. The puzzle pieces were indeed starting to fit, pointing towards a conclusion that was not just tragic but deeply disturbing. The figure wasn't just in the portrait, it was part of the Caldwell family's story, a silent tormentor that led to their eventual demise and isolation. The portrait itself started to take on a new, more sinister meaning. It was no longer just a captured moment in time, it was a warning. Dr. Reed considered the possibility that the hidden figure was an intentional inclusion, a desperate, silent scream for help from the Caldwells themselves, or perhaps even a deliberate act by the photographer. Could the photographer have seen something, felt something, and subtly tried to document it, knowing no one would believe him if he spoke openly? The subtle way the figure was hidden, almost blending into the shadows, suggested a careful placement, not just a random anomaly. The portrait was no longer a simple family photo. It had transformed into a disturbing historical artifact, a frozen moment of terror. It documented not just the innocent faces of Elara and Beatrice, but the insidious presence that stalked their home, slowly consuming their family from within. The blank face of the figure, once an enigma, now felt like a silent accusation, a testament to a horror that had been meticulously concealed from the world, only to resurface decades later through the lens of a careful observer. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Dr. Reed, solidifying her resolve to uncover the full, terrifying truth. The investigation naturally turned towards the photographer who had captured this unsettling image. Dr. Reed and her team scoured archives, old city directories, and historical society records to find any mention of photographers active in the region around 1889. It was a painstaking process, sifting through faded advertisements and brief mentions in local newspapers. Eventually, they narrowed it down to a man named Arthur Penhaligon. His studio was listed as Penhaligon's Photographic Emporium, located a few blocks from where the Caldwell house once stood. Penhaligon's other works, though rare to find, were mostly conventional portraits of families, local dignitaries, and landscapes. There was nothing overtly macabre or unusual in his known portfolio that suggested a penchant for the strange. He seemed to be a respectable, if somewhat unremarkable, local businessman. This made the Caldwell portrait even more of an anomaly. Why would this particular image from this particular photographer contain such a disturbing secret? Was it an isolated incident, a one-off deviation from his usual work, or did it hint at a hidden side to Penhaligon that history had forgotten? The possibility that Penhaligon was aware of the hidden figure, or perhaps even responsible for its presence, became a central question. It was a chilling thought. If he knew, did he include it as a deliberate artistic choice, a morbid joke, or a desperate act to document something unseen by others? The way the figure was subtly integrated into the shadows, almost blending with the background, suggested a level of intention. It wasn't a clumsy mistake or an accidental double exposure. It was placed with careful precision, designed to be easily missed, yet undeniably present for those who looked closely enough. One theory proposed that Penhaligon, like Mrs. Abernathy, might have been sensitive to the supernatural. Perhaps he perceived the presence of the silent man in the Caldwell home and, unable to speak of it openly in a society that would dismiss him as mad, chose to subtly embed it in his art. The photograph, then, became his silent testimony, a warning etched in silver halide for future generations. If this were true, it would elevate the portrait from a mere photograph to a coded message, a desperate plea for understanding from a man who saw what others couldn't or wouldn't. Another more unsettling possibility was that Penhaligon was complicit in some way, not necessarily in the horrors themselves, but perhaps in documenting them for a darker purpose. Could he have been hired by the Caldwells to capture this specific image, knowing full well what it contained? Or did he, seeing the family's distress and the presence of the entity, decide to document it as a form of macabre artistry, exploiting their tragedy for his own enigmatic reasons? The idea that the photographer might have capitalized on the family's suffering, or at least been privy to it without intervention, added another layer of darkness to the unfolding mystery. Dr. Reed considered the implications of a photographer as a silent accomplice or a reluctant witness. In an era where photography was still a relatively new and powerful medium, its ability to capture truth, or to manipulate it, was immense. Penhaligon, positioned behind his camera, held a unique vantage point. He saw the world, or at least the Caldwell household, through a lens that could reveal more than the naked eye. The portrait, then, became a testament to a secret shared between the photographer and the subject, or a silent scream from the subjects themselves that Penhaligon chose to amplify in his own subtle, terrifying way. The team managed to locate some of Penhaligon's personal effects, which had been donated to a small local museum after his death in the early 1900s. Among them were a few journals, mostly filled with mundane business records and personal musings about the changing light, the challenges of developing techniques, and the occasional complaint about difficult clients. However, one journal, bound in dark leather, stood out. It contained entries that were less about technical photography and more about observations of human nature, the unseen world, and the peculiar energies he sometimes felt in certain homes. One entry, dated just a few weeks before the Caldwell portrait was taken, read, "Visited the Caldwell residence today. A beautiful home, but a palpable chill. The children, Elara and Beatrice, seem distant, their eyes holding a sadness beyond their years. There is something else there, a shadow that clings to the corners, always just out of sight. It makes the air heavy, and the light seems to bend around it. I fear for them." This entry sent a shiver down Dr. Reed's spine. It confirmed that Penhaligon was indeed aware of an unsettling presence in the Caldwell home. Further entries detailed his struggle with how to capture this shadow. He wrote about trying different exposures, manipulating light, and even attempting to photograph areas of the house where he felt the presence most strongly. He spoke of the difficulty of photographing the unseen, of trying to make tangible what was inherently ethereal. Then, an entry after the portrait session. They asked for a family portrait, a semblance of normalcy, but the shadow was there, behind them, always watching. I tried to hide it, to make it part of the background, a trick of the eye, but it is there, a silent witness. Perhaps one day someone will see it. Perhaps then they will understand. This confirmed their darkest suspicions. Penhaligon had not only seen the entity, but he had deliberately, albeit subtly, included it in the portrait. It wasn't an accident. It was a conscious choice, a desperate attempt to record the truth he couldn't speak aloud. The portrait was no longer just a disturbing image. It was a cryptic message from the past, a chilling document of a shared secret between a terrified family and a perceptive photographer. The chilling thought that the photographer might have been complicit in a greater horror, or at least privy to it, and decided to document it in this veiled manner, solidified. The portrait became not just a piece of art, but a testament to a secret shared between the photographer and the subjects, a silent scream from the subjects themselves, amplified by Penhaligon's desperate act of documentation. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Dr. Reed, confirming her resolve to uncover the full, terrifying truth behind the Caldwell family's fate and the silent man. The innocent gaze of the sisters now seemed like a desperate plea, forever frozen in time, waiting for someone to decipher the photographer's hidden warning. The full revelation revelation hit Dr. Reed like a cold wave. The silent man, as they had come to call the hidden figure, was not a trick of light, not a ghost, but a tragically real person. Through painstaking cross-referencing of Penhaligon's journal entries with local parish records and old newspaper clippings, they finally pieced together the horrifying truth. The figure was Elias Thorne, a distant cousin of Mr. Caldwell, who had suffered from severe mental illness. In an era where understanding of such conditions was virtually non-existent, and treatment even less so, Elias was kept hidden away. He wasn't violent, but he was profoundly withdrawn, barely speaking, and often stood in the shadows, observing. The Caldwells, out of a misguided sense of duty and shame, had kept his existence a secret from the wider community, fearing social ostracization. What Penhaligon's journal hinted at, and what the parish records subtly confirmed, was a slow, agonizing decline for Elias. He was often neglected, left to his own devices, in the darker, less frequented parts of the large house. The palpable chill Penhaligon felt wasn't supernatural, but the cold, isolating reality of Elias's existence. The shadow that clings to the corners was Elias himself, a man reduced to a spectral presence in his own family's home. The sadness beyond their years in Elara and Beatrice's eyes was likely a reflection of living with this unspoken, unsettling presence, a constant reminder of a family secret that weighed heavily on their young shoulders. They were forced to pretend he wasn't there, to ignore the man who lived in the shadows. The horrifying truth behind Elias's presence in the portrait was even more heartbreaking. Penhaligon, a man who saw more than others, had noticed the physical and emotional toll this secret was taking on the girls. He saw Elias, always lurking, always just out of focus. When commissioned for the family portrait, he saw an opportunity, a desperate, silent plea for help. He hadn't just accidentally captured Elias, he had deliberately placed him subtly in the background. It was his way of documenting the hidden horror, of leaving a clue for anyone perceptive enough to find it. He couldn't openly denounce the Caldwells, given the social norms of the time, but he could use his art to speak a silent truth. The emotional impact of this revelation on Dr. Reed and her team was profound. It wasn't a ghost story, but a human tragedy, made all the more poignant by its historical context. The relief that it wasn't a supernatural entity was quickly replaced by a deep sorrow for Elias and for the burden the sisters carried. The fate of the two sisters, Elara and Beatrice, was equally tragic, directly linked to living under the shadow of Elias and the family's secret. Their lives were marked by a pervasive sense of melancholy. Elara, the elder sister, never married. She remained in the family home, caring for her aging parents, and implicitly for Elias until his eventual quiet death years later. Her later photographs showed a woman whose eyes held a permanent sadness, a quiet resignation. Beatrice, the younger, managed to escape the confines of the home, marrying a merchant from a neighboring town. However, her marriage was reportedly strained, and she suffered from bouts of deep depression. Family letters discovered in another archive spoke of her struggles with nervous afflictions and a constant feeling of being watched, even years after leaving the Caldwell residence. The hidden figure had not just been in the portrait, it had been a psychological weight that shaped their entire lives. They were victims of societal expectations and family shame, forced to participate in a silent conspiracy that robbed them of their innocence and joy. The portrait's new significance was undeniable. It was no longer just an old photograph, a curious antique with an anomaly. It was a chilling historical document, a frozen moment capturing not a ghost, but the ghost of a man and the psychological haunting of two young girls. Its value shifted from antique curiosity to a grim artifact of a past tragedy, a testament to the societal pressures and lack of understanding surrounding mental illness in the 19th century. Dr. Reed understood that the innocent gaze of the sisters was in fact a silent scream, a plea for understanding that Penhaligon, in his own quiet way, had tried to amplify. The photograph was a warning, a historical record of neglect and the profound impact of secrets. It became a powerful symbol, not of the supernatural, but of the very real, often hidden horrors of human suffering and societal ignorance. The experts, initially drawn by the mystery of a spectral figure, now felt a deep responsibility to share the true story of Elias Thorne and the Caldwell sisters, ensuring their silent suffering would finally be acknowledged. Even with the truth about Elias Thorne and the photographer Penhaligon revealed, some unsettling questions remained. The exact nature of Elias's condition, beyond the vague 19th century descriptions, could never be fully known. Did he suffer from a developmental disability, a severe mental illness, or a combination of factors that rendered him dependent and isolated? The records were too sparse, too dismissive of anyone deemed an outcast. This lingering uncertainty added another layer to the portrait's story, a reminder of how much was lost to history especially the lives of those on society's margins. The sense of dread associated with the portrait, though now rooted in human tragedy rather than the supernatural, remained. It was a different kind of dread, perhaps even more profound, because it spoke to the darkness that humans could inflict or allow to be inflicted upon one another. The psychological impact of such a discovery on Dr. Reed and her team was significant. They had started with a scientific curiosity, a puzzle to solve, but they ended with a deep emotional connection to the lives they had uncovered. It changed how they viewed historical artifacts, no longer just as objects, but as potential vessels of untold human stories, often painful ones. The implications for understanding history became clearer. It wasn't just about dates and events, but about the hidden lives, the unspoken fears, and the societal pressures that shaped individual destinies. The portrait's legacy was forever altered. It was no longer a curiosity for ghost hunters or a simple antique. It became a powerful educational tool, displayed with detailed historical context, that explained Elias Thorne's true identity and the societal conditions that led to his concealment. It served as a poignant reminder of the historical treatment of mental illness and disability and the severe consequences of social stigma. The public and the historical community viewed it with a new respect, a profound sadness, and a deepened understanding. Its place in the canon of unsettling historical artifacts was secured not because of a spectral presence, but because it documented a very real, very human horror. It became a symbol of the voiceless, a testament to those hidden away, forgotten by official histories. The story of Elias, Alara, and Beatrice, brought to light by the careful work of Dr. Reed's team, resonated deeply. It was a cautionary tale that transcended time, illustrating how fear and shame could lead families to make heartbreaking decisions, and how society's judgment could condemn innocent individuals to lives of isolation and suffering. The final warning embedded within the portrait was stark and undeniable. What seems innocent can hide the most profound terrors. The serene faces of the two sisters, once seen as merely stiff, now conveyed a deep, almost unbearable burden. The shadows in the background, initially dismissed as photographic imperfections, now held the silent accusation of a life hidden away. The reminder that some shadows, once seen, can never be unseen, became a personal truth for everyone who encountered the portrait's story. The chilling presence of Elias Thorne, no longer a ghost but a man, transcended time, reaching out from 1889 to speak to the present. His story, and the story of the sisters who lived alongside his hidden existence, served as a powerful call for empathy, understanding, and a critical examination of how society treats its most vulnerable members. The portrait, once a family keepsake, then a puzzling anomaly, finally became a beacon, illuminating a dark corner of the past, ensuring that the silent suffering it captured would never truly be forgotten. It stood as a perpetual monument to the human cost of secrets and the enduring power of truth, however painful, to finally set the record straight. The framed image, now understood, held a weight far greater than its canvas and paint, echoing the forgotten cries of a hidden life,